All right, everybody. So, welcome to this, our 24th, if you can believe it, free webinar. I can't believe it that we've been doing this for 2 years. There's still a few people filtering in here, so I will take it slow to get going. But this is our webinar on accomplishment-based coaching, and we've done that before. But in this case, it's a little bit different because what we're going to be doing is I have two of my longtime colleagues and friends, John Skank and Shane Isley, who we'll introduce shortly. And they, as well as I, have been involved in teaching and coaching our accomplishment-based coaching program. And they've had a fair amount of experience, very different characters, a very different history, as I'll explain a little bit in the introductions. But what we're going to really talk about, I'm going to provide you with a little bit of an overview. We're going to do some introductions, and then I'm going to provide you with the 15, 20 minutes of overview of accomplishment-based coaching and how it differs from the traditional sort of behavior-based coaching approaches and some of the advantages. And then we're going to have a kind of a robust discussion. I'm going to primarily function as kind of a interviewer or a question asker, but I think we'll have a nice three-way discussion about this, and then we're going to leave some time for you all to ask questions and to make comments and so forth. So that's kind of where we are. Let me introduce my friends here. Maybe I'll start with John Skank. John, I've known John, I think, for about 30 years.
Yeah.
And when I met him, he was Senior Vice President of Sales at Dun & Bradstreet, serious, big corporate leadership role. And one of the things that John always used to say to me was that he still has recently, that he said, I'm not the greatest salesperson in the world, but I'm really good at leading and managing salespeople. And that's absolutely true. We met each other a long time ago. We sort of kept in touch. And then, I don't know, 5 years ago, maybe I asked John if he would join us at the Performance Thinking Network. And he's been serving as really a senior advisor and director in our company, and also has with me and with Shane as well coached and delivered our coaching program. So I don't know, did I miss anything? Did I miss anything, John?
No, that's
you'd like
fine.
to say, okay.
No, that's fine.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say the operative word was character, because once you say they're characters, I say, yeah, that's me.
Yeah, John, the other thing to know about John is, of almost anybody I've ever known in my life, if you spend an hour with John, he'll be your best friend or one of them. He's just one of the most outgoing, genuine, authentic people in the world, and really smart. And so you don't get that sometimes because he's so friendly and nice, but it'll be really interesting to see what he has to say today. And then Shane, who I've also known for a really long time, very different background. We share behavior science together. We just realized recently that I met Shane before he was in college, when he was starting to work with kids with autism in Canada years ago, working with our colleague, my dear friend, longtime colleague, Michael Fabrizio. And then he went and got a really good background. Let's put it that way. He studied at the University of North Texas with Shala Lai and Jesus Rosales and others there about in early intervention in autism, and became a really great applied behavior analysis practitioner. And then he got his master's degree from Cloyd Heighton, who's one of the great OBM people, who's now at the Aubrey Daniels International Consulting Firm. And Shane appeared in Seattle with two businesses, really. One was the beginnings of an ABA company, which was a brilliant sort of gem of a business called Blueprints. And then also, which was merged with a larger company a few years later. And then also he started an organizational behavior management, performance improvement consulting business. And we've been working together now for quite a few years. It's stunning how many years. And Shane has taught this coaching program, our accomplishment-based approach, to a lot of folks, both inside of his own company where he mentored people and developed them, but also in a lot of applied behavior analysis, behavioral health organizations. So Shane, anything you want to add to what I just said? Your sound is off. Shane, your sound is turned off.
Sorry, I said that was very kind, and I'm happy to be here today. So thank you.
Cool. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, well, anyway, so the deal is I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of a framework. I realize that probably most of the people here know something about our work, but for those who don't, or even just to put it in context, um, John and Shane are going to disappear for a few minutes, and I'm going to give you a sort of an overview, and then we'll come back and have a discussion. So I just want to mention a few things before we get into it. One is that this video, the recording of this session, will eventually appear on our YouTube channel, which is at performancethinking.tv. And believe it or not, we've got 24 webinar recordings there now, plus some playlists, plus some presentations and such. So it's a great free resource for people wanting to learn more about all this work. You can register for these webinars at our YouTube, our homepage at performancethinking.com. There's a little thing that says Performance Thinking free monthly webinars. So if you have colleagues or friends interested in, being in other ones of these or getting the recordings, that's easy to register there. And I'm really excited to talk about our webinar next month with Bob Redeker. Bob is another of my longtime friends and colleagues. He's actually, I believe, the only person in our global network who has been certified and experienced at delivering both our coaching program and our performance consulting practitioner program. Bob brings a wealth of experience and perspective to things. And we're going to talk, at least in part, about building a community of practice, because he's certified probably close to 100 people in our practitioner program and also delivered the coaching program in various contexts. And so there's a lot of wisdom that I think we'll have a chance to talk about. So I'm really excited about having Bob in our webinar. And there's more coming. These are some of the topics that we plan to address. One of the notions of breaking down silos, where you have organizations and there's all these different departments and functions who sometimes do not collaborate that well together. And so what we propose is that there's a way to think about breaking down those silos to drive continuous performance improvement. Sort of continuing on that theme in a way, the notion of looking systemically at performance, not just one or two variables or one or two things that you might think about, but looking at the whole system that supports performance. And that also is related to why training often doesn't really do what people hope for. And so we're going to talk about that and drill into that a little bit. The fourth topic there, and I'm not sure when we're going to get to this one, but there's a lot of research out there that says from the employee's point of view, you really work for your manager. You don't work for the company. I mean, the manager really is your primary contact in most cases. And so what does that mean in terms of the manager's role in an organization to help drive performance and also engagement? And then talking about return on investment. That's a big topic, and we have a sort of a take on that. So those are some upcoming webinars. What I'd like to do, and I do this periodically, and this time I want to do it again, I want to get a sense of who's here, even though I know a fair number of you, but I want to put up a poll and have you select basically the description that best fits you. And so I'm going to put this poll up here now, and if those of you who are here with us here could select the item that sort of most fits your current role. I know you might serve in various roles. So we've got some performance consultants and executives or senior leaders, training professional, pretty interesting. So that's changing. It's always interesting to watch these things change a little bit. So just keep on going. If everybody could click on their thing. So we don't have any HR professionals. Apparently we don't have any others at this point. So the way it looks right now, and I think when I end the poll, hopefully you can see the results. But what we have mostly here are performance consultants, people in organizations or maybe as external consultants who are trying to improve performance in their organizations. We've got a few senior leaders, which is great. And then some managers and supervisors for which this is perfectly suited, this conversation. And then some training professionals. And I think that's quite interesting because not only can we offer through our training program, for example, how to do accomplishment-based coaching. But if you think about making training stick in an organization, there's a pretty compelling argument that if you have training plus are aligned with managers, supervisors, people who are actually working day to day with their people, that you can optimize the effects of training. And then we've got a few others. So thank you for that. I think that the poll should show up on your screen. If it doesn't, I've failed again in my use of the poll tool here, but anyway, thank you for filling that out. Have a better sense of who's with us. So let me go back to the slides here and talk a little bit about the origins and overview of this stuff. And again, I know I'm speaking to a lot of people who will kind of already know a lot of this, but I'll try to make it fairly quick. The big shift for many of us in the field of performance improvement came with Tom Gilbert, who was something of an iconoclast, and he published his famous book, Human Competence, over 40 years ago. It's still being studied in graduate schools. It's still being used by professionals. But in that book, he made this famous statement. He said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And he meant everybody. He meant leaders, trainers, managers, people who are always looking at one another's behavior and maybe their own behavior. But he said, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior, with an emphasis on valuable. Now, the thing about that is that shifted a whole field of performance improvement, and people defined accomplishments or started out with accomplishments rather than behavior. One of the things we did, though, a few years ago is we coined the term or the phrase work outputs, because people mean a lot of different things, it turns out, by accomplishments. And what we mean are things, the products of behavior or perhaps work, that can be counted and therefore can be plural. So as you see the slides going forward, you'll see this phrase work outputs, and it's a synonym for accomplishments. Another thing that Gilbert brought to the table was this equation or this formula, and you can apply it very quantitatively. But if we stand back and think about coaching, and we think about how do we deliver the most value we can through coaching, what Gilbert said was that worth of any intervention, whether it's training, coaching, a new system, what have you, is equal to the value of the accomplishments that it enables people to produce, divided by the cost of behavior. So if we have a very costly or ineffective intervention, but we don't produce many new or improved accomplishments, the value is not there. And of course, in current parlance, that would be thought of as return on investment. So it's a framework which I think if you look at coaching and think of coaching in these terms, it begins to make you think about maybe the accomplishment-based approach is important. So what we've said for years, and we use athletic examples often, is that human performance has three components. It has the behavior, of course, that people, individuals, teams, and so forth exhibit. But that behavior is valuable because it produces work outputs or accomplishments that are valuable because they contribute to business results. So those are the three elements. And behavior is a verb, an action. And most coaching and a lot of training focuses on behavior. Work outputs or accomplishments are actually things. They're valuable things. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different kinds of things. And they're valuable to the extent that they contribute to organizational results. So that's our basic framework. And I think sports is a really good context in which to talk about coaching, which we will do in a few minutes. So this is our first model, and most of you guys are probably aware of it. It says that behavior influences, which are all the things that we do to influence behavior that hopefully produces work outputs that achieves or accomplishes or produces organizational or business results. And if you look under the work outputs column here, you'll see a lot of different kinds. There are deliverables like widgets and plans and documents and budgets, but there's also things like transactions. There's decisions, which may be a little bit less concrete, but they're very important outputs of people. You go through a lot of effort, and then you come up with an important hiring decision or funding decision or other kind of decision. Milestones are outputs basically as they occur in sequences, in processes. Relationships are very valuable accomplishments. We even have a webinar we did on that a couple years ago, and it's still one of the most popular. And then these other things, products of communication, like people who can talk about the values of the organization, or decisions that people make after you've met with them, or appointments at the end of a phone call. Those are all products of communication activities, and so forth. So there's a lot of different kinds of work outputs, and we'll talk about that more shortly. The point is that this approach and performance improvement in general is anchored to work outputs. That's the core. That's the valuable stuff. And we also, and we're not going to talk much about it, but we use our 6 boxes model of behavior influence, which also emerged from the work, really evolved from the work of Tom Gilbert, because this is a way to think about, if we're coaching people, what are all the things we might put in place to help them improve? And if we put those two together, I often say this is everything I know about performance. It has 2 pictures, the performance chain, and the 6 boxes model, and it's 2 pictures and 21 plain English words that were user tested decades ago and tend to communicate pretty effectively. So that's kind of the really high level overview of our way of thinking about it and where this accomplishment-based approach started. But let me also now talk about coaching, because coaching is a word now. It's every place, in sales enablement, in HR discussions, all over the place. People are talking about coaching. Now, there's a bunch of models for coaching out there that are well known in the business world. DDI, for example, has this approach. And if you look at it, you see there's a process: esteem, empathy, involvement, share, support, and develop, agree, etc. But we don't know really what they're coaching to. So it could be almost anything. It's not explicitly accomplishments or behavior or competencies or anything. It's simply a conversational process, it appears. And similarly, fierce coaching is another powerful approach that's taught, and there's a lot to be learned from it, for sure. But again, it's not completely explicit about it's like, what should we be talking about? Oh, I don't know. It could be almost anything. And so it focuses kind of on behavior in most cases, but we're not sure. And then the GROW model is very familiar, and a lot of people have applied that in many organizations. And again, what's the goal? Well, it's the performer's objective for the conversation. So that could be almost anything. And there's nothing bad about any of these approaches. They could bring a lot to the table in terms of how to have conversations. But I've always believed that the word coaching is best understood in its original context of sports and athletics. And these are a bunch of accomplishments, a ball through the uprights, a golf ball in the hole. There's a lot of balls involved, right? A ball through the hoop in basketball, a goal in soccer, the car across the finish line. These are accomplishments. These are things that are produced by behavior. And so not just Gilbert, but the very word coaching itself, to me, has always meant a focus on what we're enabling people to produce, not just what they are doing. What they do may be important because they need to do the right things to produce the accomplishments. But again, it's anchored in the valuable accomplishments. So here's a very, very high-level description of the steps in what we think of as accomplishment-based coaching. First of all, let's agree on what we're going to work on if we're having a conversation, a work output or an accomplishment. That may be because there's something that needs improvement in a person's capabilities on the job. It may be because they're working toward the next step in their career path. It may be because there's a new project coming up and we got to have some team member able to produce a given kind of document or report or piece of code or whatever it is. But let's agree on an accomplishment that we want to help improve or develop. Then let's talk about what good looks like. And what we mean are the characteristics of that accomplishment, whether it's a report or a relationship or a decision, that make it a good one. And so we can get really clear between us, if I'm the coach and I'm coaching someone else, on expectations. And then we say, okay, let's talk about how much we need to talk about behavior here. Because it might be that the person being coached knows completely how to do the thing. They know what the steps are. It's just if there's other obstacles, they need support. They're lacking in resources. It's unclear what the expectations are in this case, etc. So let's talk about, do we need to get in detail about behavior, or can we sort of say, okay, you kind of know how to do that, let's move on. And then we say, okay, let's have a conversation where you and I, that is the coach and the person being coached, can have a conversation about what we could do to possibly move the ball forward, to help you, the person being coached, accomplish whatever it is more explicitly. And we use the 6 boxes model in those conversations because it gives us a complete framework for all the stuff we could do. So that's the very high level of what we mean by accomplishment-based coaching. And the logic just follows these 2 models. The conversation is, Why we talk about this? That is, what are the business or organizational results of concern? And then this output that we want to focus on. Why is it important? Does it really contribute to business results? And then let's talk about whatever level of behavior we need to talk about. And once we know that, let's think about how we might monitor improvement. And then let's use the 6 boxes model to have conversations and come up with agreed upon action steps. So that's just a more visual way to talk about those steps. It essentially starts with the conversation of let's talk about your accomplishments, the valuable things you contribute, your work outputs. That's where we're beginning. And we teach people, both in our performance consulting programs and also in our coaching programs, to use what we call an individual performance map, where the person that we're talking about is in the middle. And that may be an individual or it may be a role. The people in the boxes around the outside are their customers, the individuals or groups to whom they deliver value. And those are their work outputs: sales data summaries, answers to questions, coaching suggestions, and so forth. And we can do this. Here's an HR director in the middle. It's a particular HR director in a small medical devices company. He was delivering all those things you can see to different stakeholders or customers. And here's, for those of you in the applied behavior analysis, behavioral health world, here's the job of a clinical supervisor. That is, those are all the things that the clinical supervisor delivers to different recipients. And Shane has a lot to say about this because he's done these and worked a lot in that field. And here is another way to look at it. We very often are focusing on the individual's contributions or outputs. But particularly if we're in a sales organization or possibly a customer service organization, we can actually define the milestones or outputs that are important to achieve in a sales process. So this is a page literally from a sales coaching tool that defines some small work outputs. A cell phone number of a person in the office is an important accomplishment for some kinds of salespeople. People in the office who can verbalize the key messages. So in other words, essentially champions inside the client or a prospective client organization who can talk about our stuff. A relationship, in this case, with a medical prescriber. This is for a medical sales process. An advocate, who's a person who can promote us. Those are all outputs that you work to develop and produce. And so we can work. It's a beautiful model, actually, for moving things forward in the sales process. And John's long years of experience as a sales leader will probably put some light on that. So how is this different? Well, it's different because it focuses on valuable accomplishments. And I don't want to be too redundant, but if you look at the other coaching models out there, most of them look like some combination of almost like non-directive therapy and behavioral coaching, where we're talking about how to help people behave differently. And so we want to get to the root of the matter. We want to say, okay, you might need to behave differently, but what are the valuable accomplishments we're trying to help you develop? And then we get really clear between us, the coach and the person being coached, about what good looks like, about what a good accomplishment would be, and then what we need to talk about in terms of behavior. So we don't just assume we're going to have to talk about behavior. We use the accomplishment and the guide, the criteria for good accomplishment, whether it's a decision or a relationship or a widget or a budget or a report, whatever it is, to say, okay, how much do we need to talk about what you have to do? And so we can adjust how much detail depending on the person. And then we say, let's monitor this. Let's count the good proposals, the good relationships, the good widgets, the good treatment plans, the good session notes, whatever it is. And we can actually monitor, and in a very straightforward way between coach and coachee, we can sort of tally what are the good ones. Are you getting better at this? So that's quite different from a behavior-based approach because it's very concrete. And really it does change everything. And I think that's what our discussion will reveal somewhat. Now, if you think about the role of managers or supervisors, people who might be coaching their people, what we've always taught is that the job of a manager, a supervisor, a coach is to arrange behavior influences, as indicated by that little 6 boxes model, for the people that they coach, manage, lead, supervise, so that the people will be both productive and happy, basically engaged. So that's simple. But if you think about the coaching process, notice those orange arrows, it's a two-way conversation. It's collaborative. It's not about managers or coaches doing something to the person they're coaching. It's about a conversation where we agree on the output or accomplishment. We agree on the criteria where we get clarity on that. We talk about what level of behavior we need to discuss and if we need to get more detailed. And then we have a conversation about what we can do to move the ball forward. We can even embed that in an overall organization's talent development process. There was an article some years ago in Harvard Business Review that got my attention called Agile HR. And what it said is the most advanced organizations in terms of doing human resource development of people are relying on coaching as an engine for continuous development. So you can start out with accomplishments and recruit people, onboard them, train them for job readiness, and then you can move them into a cycle of ongoing coaching where they continue to develop their ability to produce the valuable contributions required of them by their companies. So it even fits into a larger framework here. So here's some takeaways, and then I want to have conversations with my friends and colleagues. One of them is that, again, this approach focuses on valuable contributions. And the second one is our experience, and I think John is a great example. Actually, both John and Shane, both business people in very different environments or industries. People understand this. The value is what you produce. Behavior is costly. It costs us money to hire, support, train, give people stuff, enable them to perform. And we're willing to make that expense. But what we care about are the valuable accomplishments. That's what's important. And one of the things that's nice about this is, particularly if you come from something like a servant leadership perspective, is that managers can enable their people to achieve not only business accomplishments needed for the organization, but sometimes personal ones too. And so it's potentially a kind of an engine, if you will, for continuous development of people. In contrast to that, behavior-based coaching focuses on activity. And activity may or may not be a good thing. I've been working with a sales organization recently where the senior leaders have made a big deal about face time. How much time do you actually spend with your prospective customers? Well, I don't know, but what do you produce would be my question. You can spend all day and invite them to a Super Bowl party and do all kinds of things, but you want to also produce things which move the ball forward with that activity. And finally, what I've sort of suggested, I guess, is that this approach that's focused on accomplishments can really serve as a vehicle for continuous development and servant leadership and really helping people perform well. So let me turn off the slides for the moment. And I want to sort of get the conversation going with Shane and John, if you will come back with us. So there we go.
Yeah.
So, all righty. So let's talk a little bit. I'm just looking at Maria Lourdes Rey's thing. Is there room in the model for counting and demonstrate behavior as a work output? No. You can talk about people who can behave some way. If I'm a trainer or a manager and I now have a trainee who can behave in a certain way, that's fine. But the behavior itself is only valuable if it produces something. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But anyway, so I wanted to start this out because we sort of have a history together in a way, the three of us. I want to start with Shane and then go to John. Shane, you were really well trained in organizational behavior management and behavior systems, and you've done a lot of work in that. So you have a strong background in behavior science, and you've led your own companies, and you've consulted to companies. And one of the things I'm curious about is when in that kind of, whatever you want to call it, period of whatever it is, 20 some years, or 30 maybe, I forget how long it's been, did the focus on accomplishments become crystal clear to you? Because I think a big thing that happens with people is at some point they say, oh, this is about the valuable contributions people make. And I'm wondering if you even remember, or if it was a gradual process, or like, how did this evolve in your head? I guess is my question.
Yeah, well, like you said, I was very fortunate to receive really great training in organizational behavior management from Dr. Claude Huygen. And and so we learned about Tom Gilbert, and we read behavior engineering, um, learned how to describe and talk about the behavior engineering model. But it wasn't really until sort of um, that I started my first company where it kind of really dawned on me the power of accomplishments, and that's really where it rang true in terms of what Gilbert taught us, that, and you pointed out that behavior is costly and accomplishments add value. So we um, in an early on after grad school, I started a family centered intensive intervention program. And this was in Seattle, and there were already very good behavior analysts working there. And so I really didn't have much sort of room for error. And so we were trying to create like a new service model and build up a reputation. And we really needed to produce change. We really needed to produce results, so that people would trust us and that we would be a viable option, for helping families. And so that's kind of when we looked and said, okay, if we're going to do this, what is it that, both the employees need to be able to produce, and also what do we need to help parents and families, or parents and caregivers, produce? So things like successful morning routines would be an example. And then for staff, treatment plans and safety plans and stuff like that. And so because we were bringing in different models and disciplines in order to create this service, we really needed to focus on what people needed to produce and not worry about all the things they needed to know.
Right.
And so that's really where it started for me.
See, to me, that's so cool what you just said, because, when you're sort of in an academic environment, it's all kind of interesting. But when you got to pay the rent or whatever, when you got to get your business going, that's why I say most business people that I've spoken with get it about accomplishments. They say, oh yeah, we need to produce whatever decisions, etc. So turning to John, who was different world, big corporate background originally, sales though, which is a place where people know about results. We've known each other for, I think, 30 years, plus or minus, if I remember, John. And you when we first met, I was talking more about the 6 boxes model, and we sort of talked a little about accomplishments, but not much. But I'm sort of wondering how your evolution has occurred in terms of sort of seeing the value of this approach.
Yeah, well, really very, very early in my career, my mentor, even though I only met him one time, but through all of his writings, and he was a sports figure. He was the coach of the UCLA basketball Bruins, right? So they won 10 championships in a row. And I just loved everything about him, ethically, morally, and just that he was a winner. But one of his key phrases, and this was in the early 70s, do not confuse activity with achievement. And I kept saying, well, that's all they do, these sports people. They run up and down the court and all that stuff. And what he was really driving all of his players to do is the most important thing was, as you showed an example here, put the ball in the hoop or win the game. And I never forgot that. And I started to realize in the environment I was in, everybody was doing things. It was like, right, you just have these people running in circles doing things. And I said, well, how do I know they're doing the right things? And some of that focus may be on behavior. Some of that might be on call times and all of those. But then when I met you, and I had already gone through a couple of levels of management, and Tom Hogan, God rest his soul, who was the most forward-thinking learning and development professional I ever met. So he was the VP of training at the company. he and I became very, very, very close friends. And he saw things the same way. He said, look at all these people doing things. So he and I would go to lunch more often than not. We would have the conversation on, okay, but are they improving? Can we promote them? Are there things that we should be looking at that really tells us they're accomplishing things, not just making calls, doing things during the day, checking off, a list. So it's really the influence of Tom and with you that got me, because you actually did talk about accomplishments at that time. Yeah. But our focus was on behavior influences, tools and resources, expectations, feedback, all the things that we had to do in managing our people to bring them, to improve their behavior. But as you mentioned, what does that behavior produce? And if I had the best behaving people, but we were missing quota by $1 million, that's not a good thing.
That's not it, right?
So, it's all of those things. Yeah, it was all of those things. But John Wooden in particular, because I said that's all I thought he cared about was people being in shape and running up and down the basketball court. Now, he was concerned about winning.
You went balls to the hoops. Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting as I listen to both of you, I realize I have pretty deep connection with both of you in terms of the worlds I work in, because I was doing applied behavior analysis before it was called that, more or less, back in the early 70s. And I was doing sales enablement for a long time. And one of the things I'm struck by in listening to you, John, is how sales is an area where people know they've got to produce, appointments, meetings with the CFO, the buying decisions. So when we've worked with salespeople before, when I've worked with them and I go in with an accomplishment-based approach, salespeople will tell me, they'll say, when my manager comes out and, rides with me and is always checking off my behavior, I know the stuff I'm supposed to do to score well in this behavior checklist. But this whole thing about what I need to accomplish, that's what I think about before I go into the client. That's what I think about do I need a new relationship? Do I need to get in front of the CFO? Do whatever it is. And so your background, to me, leads naturally into this. So that's great. So thank you.
You mentioned relationships because, that to me was probably the biggest work output, because they had to have multiple relationships in each one of these clients. And internal as well as external, because your internal relationships are as important in moving the ball forward.
Yeah, we've worked with, for example, Barbara Buckland and I did some projects with some medical devices and pharmaceutical companies, where the salespeople, they had to have relationships with a lot of different players inside of hospitals and health centers in order to move things forward, and they could check off which ones they were working on, which were not so good yet, which ones which were good because they contributed to their ability to do business and so forth. So, John, continuing with you, one of the things you said to me a long time ago, and we've had this conversation on and off, you used the word framework. And when I first met you, and since then, you're such a friendly person that I never felt intimidated. But I always thought, this guy's a senior vice president of sales at Dun & Bradstreet. He knows a heck of a lot more about, performance and down and dirty world than I do. But you used to say that what was cool about our frameworks is that they gave you a place to put things you already knew. And so what I was struck by was this approach is not just good for beginners, like Shane might be developing new managers or new clinical supervisors, but it's also a framework that more sophisticated, advanced leaders and managers can use. So can you talk a little bit about that notion of a framework and how it's useful?
Definitely. For me personally, my mind at times, I can be pretty scattered, right? And if there are a lot of things on the table and you're traveling and you're doing all these things and you have offices all over, and, how do you put it all together? Well, you really have to be able to say, this is where I need to focus. And you have those. So we use the 6 boxes as a good example of how do I take what I'm doing during the day? And if there's a problem with performance, in all likelihood, could be in skills and knowledge, but it's probably in tools and resources. What do I need to do as a senior officer, because I had the budget to do it, to improve that atmosphere, to improve that work environment, to improve the things these people need to perform better? So, that's the framework. And I started to think about that I could not go any further without being able to put things into, and we talk about boxing, but even in my personal life, I like to think of things in quadrants, right? I do my budget in quadrants. I like things to be put in order so that, I know where they are. I know if there's an issue that I can go there and then find support in order to get that done. And so, I always found like this with the performance chain, and it's a framework. I'm not saying there aren't other ones out there, but it's a framework built around accomplishments that makes an awful lot of sense. And if you follow it, the people who are working with you, will follow along also. And it becomes, you talk about collaboration, it becomes, we all own it together. So it's not me against you. It's really looking at a system of performance and letting them know that's the way we're going to improve performance, not just dwell on behavior.
Yeah, there's a couple of things you say there that I think are really interesting beside the kind of clear stuff you said. One of them is, if you think about those other coaching models that I was kind of flashing on the screen earlier, it's vague as to what their objectives are. They could be, what's your problem? Or let me help you figure out what it is. And your problem could be almost anything. But the framework, if you will, of the performance chain says, we need to identify the thing you need to produce, the high priority thing you need to produce for the organization or the business or your whatever it is. And then we can look at all the other stuff. But that's one way in which a framework clarifies things. And then the other comment I wanted to make, go ahead.
Well, I
was going to say, just to finish that.
No, you go first, and then I'll interject with you.
I was just going to say that the notion of a framework is another reason I think our clients wound up giving us the rename of our company, which is the Performance Thinking Network, because these frameworks help you think more crisply, I think.
Yeah,
but what were you going to say, John?
And, well, I wanted to just interject. I think you recall at the beginning of September, Forrester Research, I volunteered and they approached me, that would I be interested in being interviewed, talking about coaching. And they're doing this whole sales guide, the managers to coaching. And it transcends sales, by the way, because the people who even interviewed, this is not about just sales. This is about anything we do. So we spoke for about an hour, and I knew I was telling them things that they never heard before because I was talking about accomplishment-based coaching and everything. And I thought for sure they were just going to spill back everything about behaviors and everything that we see from everyone else. And lo and behold, they come back and they said, well, we've looked at all these things and we picked the Performance Thinking Network as one of the frameworks we think fits well into the way we should be coaching. And then my quote, which I don't think I did the exact quote, they always paraphrase, but the quote was, coaching is a collaborative conversation. And then I went into, how we do the ABC and how you brainstorm and choose what you should be working on. It becomes, when you coach on behaviors, as I was telling them, you sometimes put the person you're coaching on the defense. They think you're telling them they're doing something wrong, even though they think they're the best in the world. When I look at accomplishments, it becomes objective and you can agree on it. And either their account plan is a good one or not, usually dictated by the client. Or if the process is a good one or isn't, or the handoff during a stage gate process, all of those things, when you're looking at it, if it's good, and if the customer thinks it's good, you can move forward. But if it's not, how do you help them be better performers? And you take away that whole subject of, oh, you're yelling at me. No, we're working on this together. So they did put it in there, and it should be published probably any day now.
Oh, very nice. Well, that's, what you just said. You've said this to me before, but the light just went on big time for me, which is that a lot of the stuff that goes on in terms of conflictual, no, you said this, no, it's your fault stuff, is about behavior, right? It's about what people did.
Yeah.
But if we can agree on, as I was saying earlier in this sort of takeaways, what a good proposal is, what a good treatment plan is, what a good decision is, then the two of us, whoever we are, can collaboratively look at this and problem solve it and figure out how to improve it. So it kind of changes the tone of it. So let me ask Shane something, which is a parallel question, which is that you've worked, you have this background in behavior science, and like as I do, and you've worked with a lot of applied behavior analysts, and so people in that world bring an enormous amount of expertise around how to define and change and improve behavior. I'm wondering, in your experience of training people to be coaches in ABA companies and having your own company, how this accomplishment-based coach approach sort of sits with them, and how you've been able, are there insights and like, oh, this makes a difference that you've observed among our behavior, applied behavior science colleagues?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, for sure. I think that the great thing is that it doesn't, everything that they learn, right? As you pointed out, I've have multiple degrees in behavior analysis, so this approach doesn't take away from all the skills and knowledge and strategies that we use. It just expands on them, right? So, like instead of, for example, just looking at sort of the basic view of looking at behavior of what happens before and what are the consequences, this framework, the 6 boxes, allows us to think more broadly about what in the environment is currently supporting or obstructing performance, and then also what within the person's own knowledge and experience may be helping or hindering their performance.
Mm-hmm.
So it is expansive, but then once that you sort of analyze those variables, then you can start to use the same strategies that through behavior science. So if I need to deliver more effective feedback, right, or I need to arrange consequences that are actually going to function as rewards, or what we would say reinforcers, then I can do it. So to answer your question, it's usually very well received. I think where the thing that I notice, sort of the shift happens, is that once people start to look at accomplishments and say, okay, what is the valuable product of this behavior, and how does it connect up to what we're trying to achieve at the organizational level, right? Those business results like service quality or client progress. Then from there, you have your analysis and essentially your improvement efforts that are anchored in accomplishments, and you say, okay, well, what then behavior is needed in order to produce that? And so when you do that, then you can, it frees up more solutions, getting better tools, setting clear expectations, right? And it doesn't necessarily just default you to training, which is
no kidding.
a little bit of a I would say a problem or an overused intervention in the industry and where I work. It's just because most people are coming out of a graduate program, they become a supervisor, and they've received a lot of training, right, to learn these skills and knowledge. But in the workplace, it's not very cost efficient to pull people off, right? And put them and spend all day or all week learning skills and knowledge that may be helpful, but may not be necessary for them to produce the output that is part of their job. And so I think that's where there's a really big shift with the people that I work with.
So I would say that it's not just in your world. It's we see this in the corporate environment all the time, that the default value is, they got a performance problem, train them. So the 6 boxes framework gives us a bigger thing. But I would also, the other thing that I'm struck by is that if, behavior scientists get it, and I've now worked with quite a few people in the applied behavior analysis world, not nearly as many as you have, but what I find is that people with a background in behavior science are rather analytical by tendency. They like that, et cetera. And so we give a flexible framework, but we've defined the units in the performance chain in 6 boxes pretty precisely, so that a behavior analyst can take the performance analysis quite nicely in terms of identifying the stuff and then looking at the behavior influences and so forth. So that's pretty interesting. So let me continue a little bit. Both of you guys have taught this, and you've worked with different kinds of people. You even, I think, taught together, if I recall, at our last Summer Institute. And so, and I've taught it also. And there's this thing that I always say that the light bulb goes on. Like at some point, people say, oh, this whole accomplishment thing does kind of change everything, because it sort of pulls everything we know, both about behavior and the stuff we can do to improve it, through to some kind of result. And so I've always seen aha experiences or things where people learn something about that they can't kind of unlearn. And I'm wondering, maybe I'll start with Shane. I'm wondering what you've observed as you've developed coaches when they've gotten the idea about, oh, we're focusing on accomplishments now.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things, and I think John touched on some of them. So first, it's like, especially when I work with new supervisors or managers, right? They're a little unsure of what they should be doing. They know that they're responsible for supporting the performance of their direct reports, but they don't necessarily know where to start, or all the things that they should be doing. And that becomes stressful and overwhelming, and right, and then there's negative impact on their employees. What I see is we give them a logic, right? A coaching logic, essentially. It says, okay, what's at stake for the organization, right? What does a person need to produce in their job in order to help achieve that for the organization? And what does a good one look like? And we walk them through these steps that can be, the information can be gathered through a conversation. And then they say, okay, now we know we've defined the performance that we either want to establish or we want to improve. What do I need to do? What does the organization need to put in place? And what can you do? And you come up with agreed upon steps. And then you work, as John said, in a collaborative way to do that. And so you're making these decisions. Okay, I need to create a set of expectation documents, or I need to, make it easier, this system, right? Easier to access, or less steps to use to produce the product or whatnot. And so you're not constantly guessing and unsure. So it builds confidence, and it's an approach that you can always come back to.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about John's world and his history. And, when you have, so what you just described, it seems to me, is a person who comes in kind of with a blank slate. It's like, what do I do now? And so you give them this framework, and like you said, they can move forward. But I'm also struck that when I speak with my colleagues who are senior folks as leaders, managers, and so forth, they've been through it all. They've learned all the various tools and models, and they've read all the magazines, and they know about mindset, and you name it. In some ways, there's an overwhelming number of things that they could do. And a lot of times it's, let's pull out the thing that we just are into this year, like, whatever, learning in the flow or something. And so what I'm struck by is that for an experienced person, the logic of this also clarifies in a different way. It kind of cuts through the noise. And I'm wondering, John, in your experience of talking about accomplishments and such to people, what have you observed about that, about sort of clarity and insight that comes from it?
You showed it early on, and Shane is right. We spend this time in these coaching programs, and the first thing you have to get through is defining what a work output is, right? Getting them to use a different vocabulary. But as you talk to some of the senior people, and I've done, and you showed the individual performance map. And the other reason I like going through that, one of the reasons, I'd like them to see their job on one piece of paper. And I've had many people come back to me and say, wow, this is what I do on one piece of paper. But you can see it. And you then take them away from just the behaviors. Well, I analyze this and I do that. No, what are you producing? And once they see all their contributions, they can offload things if they feel they have to offload things to free up their time to do something else. but they really get an understanding of what the accomplishment is, right? So that if they were to talk to people who work for them, they're able to talk in that language and be consistent in the way they speak to them in that language. But I always found when people say, boy, I'm looking at my job in one page, that's pretty valuable.
Yeah, it is. It's true. That's a big deal. That makes a lot of sense. Well, one thing I'm noticing the time, and we promised that we would have some conversation, and I want to ask you guys a couple more things, but I want to encourage the participants here, the people who are attending, to use the chat box now if you have questions or topics that you'd like us to address. We will probably go over a little bit over the hour. If you have to drop off, understood, but this thing is going to get recorded and you'll get a link to it so you can see the last 10 minutes if you have to leave a little bit early. So use the chat box to raise issues or comments or whatever, please. But getting back to our discussants here, one of the things that I believe, and I've seen it in some organizations that we worked in, is when you have this accomplishment-based approach, it can, as I said in the little overview, it can support a continuous talent development process because people are getting better at producing the stuff they have to produce in their jobs. And if they keep doing that, they'll get better they'll learn how to produce the things for the next level on their career path ladder and so forth. And it also seems to me that it has the potential for creating a culture if you really, install this in an organization. And let me ask Shane this question, because you've both in your own organization over an extended period of time, and I've known some of the people that worked with and for you, and they're stunning in their ability to look at performance. And I've also know that you've worked with some client organizations over an extended time. So have you seen this kind of accomplishment-based ongoing coaching thing turn into almost like a cultural thing or a context where people say, oh, this is about continuous development? Has that been a thing for you at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So, both in my own organization and then, like you said, in organizations that I've, delivered the program and consulted with, is that they start to sort of look at the whole, process from when an employee enters the organization through to, through their hiring, their onboarding, and how they get prepared for their job, and then ongoing how that they're supported on the job, but also then maybe prepared for a new opportunity, a promotion, or a new role or project. And like John was saying, it kind of starts with accomplishments or work output.
Yeah.
So when you're hiring someone, instead you could say, have you ever produced one of these before? And talking about it in terms of establishing a good relationship or decisions that they've made. And then when you're preparing someone for the job, especially like in this line of work of applied behavior analysis, for people with behavioral challenges, there's so much that people need to learn and know how to do. And so how do you break that down into, okay, how do we get this person to where they need to be in order so that they can start delivering services, right? Mm-hmm. And so then you look at the first sort of initial set of accomplishments. Okay, they need, to be able to make database decisions. They need to produce graph data. They need to, establish a relationship with a client. And then so that's where you start your, what I refer to as like job readiness program. You help them get good enough at those things so that they can start helping the children and families. And then you kick into the ongoing coaching for the other outputs in their job. And it really streamlines things in terms of preparing, and people are feeling a lot more comfortable and engaged when they're starting. And those are the reports that I've had from my own employees and from our clients.
So, that makes me think of something I hadn't thought of before. But when you look at the current, resignation, the great resignation, and people's concerns about retaining employees, and a lot of the data that people have collected about that, one of the biggest stories is that employees leave because they don't feel like they're being given resources to develop. And if I've ever heard of an environment that might support development, it would be this accomplishment-based coaching approach, particularly if it were lined up with a training organization that focused their training efforts on enabling people to produce accomplishments, where the objectives were accomplishments. So it seems like this accomplishment-based approach makes people feel, you kind of said this, like they're developing, and it seems to me that that's going to be part of keeping people sticking around. As long as they can develop, move up the career path, learn how to do new valuable things, that seems like a pretty big deal to me.
Absolutely,
very, very much so.
So let me just ask. First of all, there have been no more comments in the chat, although maybe there's some stuff in the Q&A. There's not. So let me ask you two guys. Maybe I'll start with John. We're sort of at the end of the hour now, and I wonder if there's any kind of parting comments or insights that you don't think we've touched on or that are worth saying at this point, John.
Yeah, I would just say, in fact, another quote in this article is that, if managers spend all their time looking at the data, which they have to, okay, you have to look at that, and you have to look at numbers and all of that thing. But she was insisting that if you're forgetting about focusing on the people, you're missing the point of coaching altogether. Right. And that resonated. And I think the takeaway is that it actually can be very fun, but I mean, really, it's about the conversation. It really is. It's about the conversation and the relationship with the people you have working within your organization. And as I spoke to the people at Forrester, I said, if a company says they have a coaching culture, they probably don't. It's not when you tell people you have it, it's when you have it. I mean, it's there. It's there. It's embodied when you think about it. And, I thought for sure that's when they were going to hang up the phone on me, but they didn't. They kept listening because, me, I like to incite. But the parting message to me is it's about the conversation. And use all the data you have around you. Use all of that, but make it a good, fun, collaborative conversation that's to the benefit of the person to whom you're coaching. Because one thing is managing activity is different than coaching. Okay, so I can go through all the activity in the world. That's managing activity. Coaching is really helping develop the person and helping improve performance and business results through those people.
So, you sort of just said something that I thought was pretty interesting about, okay, now I've forgotten it. I can't believe it. There was an insight from what you said that I wanted to expand on. I'll maybe come back with it. Let me ask Shane the same question. Any final comments or observations that you would like to add?
I mean, I think John summarized it very well. From sort of my perspective in behavioral health organizations, people are the company's greatest assets, right? And so it's important to show that you are invested in them, that you support them, and you care about their development and their well-being. And the best way to do that is to have, as John said, ongoing coaching conversations, building a relationship, from the very start. This is, hey, this is not all on you. This is performance is the responsibility of the company, me, your supervisor, and you. And we're going to work together as a team and try to optimize your environment so that you can perform at your best, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. One is I want to address Holly's comment in the chat box, which I sort of did with a little text. But before I do that, I remember what I was going to say about John, which is the focus on the conversation. The coaching program that we have now is based on a management program that I developed with Cineverse like 15 years ago, high-tech company. And we had development plans as the main output of that. And we went to some of our client organizations that were already working with us in performance consulting, and they said, we don't want any more paperwork. We just want you to establish a way to have a conversation that will develop people. And so our coaching program is exactly what you said, John. It's about a collaborative conversation that continues to develop people's ability to deliver value to the organization and probably to their own lives in a way that's engaging. And to respond to Holly's comment, what I would say, the accomplishment of a successful coaching relationship is a person who continues to develop, who demonstrably can add more value to the organization. Would you guys kind of agree? Is that a reasonable response?
Yeah.
Yes.
So how about you, Holly? Do you think?
And to themselves, not only the organization, ever adding more value to themselves and worth to themselves. And it's a box 6 thing, right? You know, they feel good about themselves, their motives and preferences. They're going to stay with your organization. They're going to be happy.
Yeah, I think it's a big deal. So Holly, does that respond reasonably to your comment or your accomplishment of successful coaching relationship?
Yep.
You know, good relationships also keep people. Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. That's the other thing, by the way, just to emphasize, and then I think we probably need to wrap up. I've got a couple more slides, but the relationship thing is a big deal. And, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to start this webinar series over 2 years ago was because we'd done a thing at our summer institute. Yes, exactly. It's a continual growth, Holly. But was that we had done this thing at our summer institute about relationships as valuable accomplishments. And everybody got all happy about that. It was kind of a lot of joking because they were talking about their personal relationships as well as their business relationships. And we did a webinar, the third webinar we did. And if you go to the YouTube channel and click on the webinars playlist, and you actually click on the thing that says playlist, one of the earliest webinars was on relationships as a valuable accomplishments. And you can define in each case what a good relationship would look like. And then you can do whatever it takes to develop that. And so I think that some of the comments in the chat and what we've been saying is a big deal. So even if growth means that the person leaves the organization, maybe so, Holly, that's quite possible. Sure. One of the challenges, of course, is you would like to have an organization where there's a career path that people are attracted to. But I remember actually in that Cineverse where we first developed this, there was a phrase they used called exporting talent. And this wasn't necessarily about leaving the company. What it was typically about is leaving the team. So managers would be uptight because some of their best people were going off and being made into managers. And the company said, no, that's a good thing. We want to develop people so they have the capacity to take on more, bigger jobs and so forth. So, yeah, fair enough, Catherine Graham, exactly. Yeah, so I think, anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off, John.
No, so let me. Catherine's quote was great.
Yeah, I think so too. So let me just go back a little bit to the. All right. Well, I can't finish the slides, it turns out, because something about Webinar Jam is not working properly, which bothers me. But so what I was going to say is that thank you, everybody. Thank you for your presence here. We have a slide that Webinar Jam seems to be preventing me from using right now. But what we wanted to say is there's a lot of free resources. Our YouTube channel is performancethinking.tv. Our website is performancethinking.com, and you can go to the resource library and get some interesting publications and such. There's a Facebook channel Facebook group about performance thinking for ABA and behavioral health, which is sort of Shane's baby. And we also have a LinkedIn group. So if you look up Performance Thinking Network in LinkedIn, you'll find our group. And it's mostly because not everybody interacts with it. It's very often just our giving updates and such. But frankly, if you raise an interesting question there's usually somebody to respond in an interesting way. So it's a pretty good resource. So thank you, everybody. I think we're done.
Okay, thank you.
Bye for now.
Okay.
All righty.